The chair had been sitting there for 400 years, and nobody had bothered to tell me. I found out the same way I found out most things during that first week aboard the Conclave station. By accident, by asking the wrong question at the wrong time, and by being too stubborn to let the silence that followed swallow the answer whole. My name is Yara Osei. I am 37 years old. I hold a doctorate in xenolinguistics from the University of Edinburgh, a second one in comparative political theory from Nairobi, and until 6 months ago I held a position as a junior attaché at the United Nations Office of Extraterrestrial Affairs, which was a department so obscure that most people in the building did not know it existed. My entire job was translating signal fragments and writing reports that exactly 3 people read. I was very good at it. I was also completely unprepared for what happened next. Contact, when it finally came, did not arrive with fanfare. There were no lights in the sky, no global broadcast, no moment of collective human breath. A Velhari courier ship entered our solar system on a Tuesday afternoon, transmitted a formal diplomatic greeting in 17 languages including, impressively, a passable attempt at Swahili, and requested a single representative to travel with them to the seat of the Galactic Conclave for the purposes of membership induction. The Velhari were polite, patient, and extremely specific about the word single. One human. That was all they wanted. The United Nations spent 11 days arguing about who it should be. I was chosen on the 12th day, mostly because I was the only person in the building who had already packed a bag. I had packed it the moment the signal came in, the same afternoon, because I had spent 4 years reading signal fragments that pointed toward exactly this moment, and I was not going to miss it over committee deliberations. Thesivane met me at the docking ring. She was the first Velhari I had ever seen in person, rather than in a transmitted image, and the transmitted images had not quite prepared me for the scale of her. Velhari were tall, pale blue in the indirect lighting of the station corridor, with wide dark eyes, and a stillness to their movements that reminded me of deep water. She bowed in the Velhari fashion, both hands pressed flat to her sternum, and said my name with a precision that told me she had practiced it. "Dr. Osei," she said, "we are glad you came." "I am glad I was asked," I said, which was the honest truth. She guided me through the docking corridor and into the outer ring of the station. I had read every available file on the Conclave's physical structure during the 2-week journey, but reading a file and standing inside the thing itself were 2 entirely different experiences. The station was vast in a way that made the word vast feel inadequate. It was old in a way that made human history feel recent. The corridors curved upward in long arcs, and through the observation panels I could see the binary stars at the system's heart burning low and amber in the distance. Everything smelled of something I had no name for. Not unpleasant, just completely, irreversibly alien. "There are protocols for a new member's first session," Thesivane said as she walked. "I will guide you through them. The primary session begins in 2 hours. You will be formally acknowledged. You will be given observer status pending the ratification vote, and you will be introduced to the presiding archivist. Do not speak until spoken to in formal session. This is not a rule of disrespect. It is a rule of survival. Some of the species present have communication methods that overlap with what your brain would interpret as a direct neural event if exposed without preparation." "Understood," I said. I had noted that warning in the files. "What else?" "Do not touch anything in the chamber without asking first. Do not offer your hand in greeting. Not all species understand the gesture, and 2 of the ones present would interpret it as a territorial challenge." She paused. "And if you see a chair that appears to belong to no one, do not sit in it." I should have asked more about that last instruction. I did not, because at that moment we turned a corner and the main session chamber opened ahead of us, and every thought I had evaporated completely. The chamber was a perfect circle, vast enough that the far side was slightly hazy with distance. The ceiling was transparent, and through it the binary stars filled the view like 2 slow eyes. Around the circular table sat representatives of 214 species, and the variety of shapes and sizes and colors and methods of simply existing in space was enough to stop a person mid-step. I stopped. Thesivane, to her credit, waited beside me without comment. I had approximately 2 seconds to feel overwhelmed before I noticed the chair. It was not like the others. The others were adapted to the physical requirements of whoever occupied them. Some low, some high, some built for bodies with configurations I could not easily describe. But there was one chair, positioned at what I instinctively recognized as the head of the table, that was built for a human being. It was old, not old in the way that expensive furniture is made to look old in the way that something genuinely is, when centuries of dust and stillness have settled into its grain. It was carved from a dark wood that I could not identify, smoothed at the armrests from what must have been long use at some point, though it had clearly not been used in a very long time. On the back of it, mounted in a metal frame that was slightly tarnished, was a placard. Even from the distance of the entrance I could read it. I had excellent distance vision. It was one of my less useful skills until that exact moment. The placard read, "Earth, Sol System, Humanity." I said, before I could stop myself, "Whose chair is that?" The room went quiet. Not gradually. Not in the way a room quiets when someone says something surprising. All at once. Immediately. Completely. 214 species and their associated translators and observers fell silent at exactly the same time, and the silence that resulted was not the absence of sound, so much as the presence of something else entirely. It pressed against my ears. It pressed against my chest. I felt it in the back of my teeth. Thesivane did not answer immediately. She looked at the chair, then at me, then at the archivist at the far end of the table, and something passed between them in an expression I could not yet read. Then I walked to the chair and sat down in it. I did not plan to. I want to be clear about that. It was not a statement. It was not a political act. I sat in it because my legs had decided, while my brain was still catching up, that this was the logical thing to do. The chair was the right height. It fit me the way something fits when it was made with you in mind. The armrests were exactly where my arms wanted to rest. The silence, if possible, deepened. The archivist was a species I recognized from the files as Kavith, tall, many-limbed, with a face that was more expression than feature. They were looking at me with something I had no word for yet, not anger, not shock, something older than both. "Earth," the archivist said, in a voice that the translation matrix rendered into English with a sound like two instruments playing the same note in slightly different keys. "Sol System. Humanity, present at last." I said, "Thank you for the chair. I was wondering about the placard." A ripple moved around the table. Not laughter exactly, but something in the same family. The session proceeded. Thesivane guided me through the protocols she had described. I was formally acknowledged. I was granted observer status. I was introduced to the archivist, whose name in Kavith had 7 syllables and a tonal component that my vocal anatomy was not equipped to produce, and who told me to call them Ves. I did my job. I listened, and I translated, and I asked questions only when permitted, and I kept my voice level, and my face neutral, even when what I was hearing made my pulse double. It was only later, when the session had closed and the chamber had emptied, and Thesivane walked me back through the long, curved corridors to my assigned quarters, that she said the thing I had not expected. "You need to understand something, Dr. Ose." "Yara," I said. I had been saying it since the docking ring, but she kept forgetting, or perhaps she kept choosing not to use it. I was not yet sure which. She paused at the door to my quarters. The hallway stretched behind her, quiet and amber-lit, and the binary stars were visible through the panel above her head, burning slowly in the dark. "The reason that chair has been empty," she said, "is not because you were not invited." I waited. "It is because every time we sent an invitation, something happened to the delegation." She said it carefully, with the precision of someone who had chosen each word in advance. And then she said goodnight, and she left, and I stood in the doorway of my quarters for a long moment, looking at the stars through the panel, turning that sentence over in my mind, like a stone that might have something living underneath it. I did not sleep that night. I made a cup of terrible instant coffee from the supply I had packed in my bag, and I sat at the small desk in my quarters, and I thought about every delegation that had never arrived. I had no idea yet how many there had been. I had no idea yet what had happened to them, but I was already certain, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who has spent 4 years reading fragments and listening to silences, that the answer was going to be the most extraordinary thing I had ever heard. I was right. I was also completely wrong about what kind of extraordinary it was going to be. The archivist found me in the outer observation gallery the following morning, before Thesivane had come to collect me for the day's sessions. I was standing at the curved transparence panel watching the binary stars, which I had decided I was going to do every morning for as long as I was here, because they were one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen, and I was not going to take them for granted. Vess moved with the particular unhurried quality of something very old, and they stood beside me for a moment without speaking, and then they said, "You did not sleep." "No," I agreed. "How could you tell?" "You are on your third cup of that substance," they said. "We have been observing your quarters' environmental systems. The heating element activated twice in the night." "That's slightly alarming," I said. "It is standard monitoring for all new arrivals. You are not a prisoner. You are a guest whom we have been waiting 400 years to receive, and we simply wanted to make sure you did not accidentally harm yourself by touching the wrong surface in the dark." Vess tilted their head in what I had already come to understand was the Kavith gesture for a kind of careful concern. "Will you come with me? There is something you need to see." The archive room was not on any map I had been given. It was not on any map I had been able to find in the station's public directory. It was 3 levels below the session chamber, accessed through a corridor that Vess opened with a biometric sequence their body performed automatically, and when the door slid open, the smell that came out was the smell of something very old and very carefully preserved, dry and clean and slightly sharp, like cold air on a high mountain. The room was circular, of course. Everything in the conclave station was circular, but where the session chamber was vast and open, this room was dense with storage, columns of data holdings rising from floor to ceiling, each column holding records in a format that shifted depending on what species had generated them. Some were crystalline, some appeared to be biological in some way I chose not to examine too closely. Some were simply text, in scripts I could identify, and scripts I could not. Vess led me to a section near the center of the room and activated a display surface with one of their long hands. "These are the Earth contact records," they said, "sealed since the founding charter. No non-member species has ever been permitted to view them. You are now a provisional member. The records are yours to read." I sat down in front of the display surface and began. The first record was dated in Conclave Standard Time, which I had to convert, and when I ran the conversion, the result came back as the year 1610 in the Earth calendar. The record described a diplomatic vessel, registry designation KV-1, belonging to a species called the Keth, a founding member of the Conclave with a history of over 4 million years, that had been dispatched to the Sol system on a first contact mission. The vessel had entered the system, approached the third planet, and transmitted an initial greeting signal. The greeting signal had received no response. The vessel had then entered the upper atmosphere of the third planet and landed in a region the Conclave's cartography designated as Western Europe. The record ended there. There was a follow-up note added 14 years later, in 1624, in a different hand. It said simply, "No further contact received. Mission outcome, unknown. Chair reserved per founding charter." I stared at that entry for a long time. Then I moved to the second record. The second contact attempt had been made in 1628. A Velhari scout vessel, not a full diplomatic mission, just a scout, had entered the Sol system and approached the third planet at a cautious distance, monitoring the energy signatures from orbit before committing to an approach. The Conclave's records noted that the planet was emitting unusually high energy readings for a civilization at its apparent technological stage. The scout vessel's instruments had interpreted this as a sign of advanced industrial or social activity and had begun its descent approach. The energy readings, it turned out, were coming from a city called London. The high readings were from the Great Fire. The scout vessel had observed from a distance, determined that the planet was in a state of catastrophic civil event, and withdrawn. The report filed on return described Earth as a Category 9 volatile civilization, and recommended that future contact missions be delayed until the surface situation stabilized. The third attempt had been in 1789. I already knew, before I turned to that record, what had been happening in 1789. I knew it the way every person who had ever studied European history knew it, which is to say I knew it deeply, in the way that large and terrible and complicated things embed themselves in a person's understanding of how the world works. A diplomatic pod had set down in France. The envoys who had stepped out had encountered a public execution in progress, a city in the grip of a revolution, crowds in the streets, and a government actively dismantling itself in real time. The envoys had retreated to their vessel within 40 minutes. Their report used a phrase that the translation matrix rendered as organized self-destruction by the dominant population class, and recommended against contact for at least another 2 centuries. I read them all. Every one. Verdun, in 1916, where a conclave observer drone had been mistaken for an artillery shell, and the noise had been so constant and so immense that the drone's instruments had failed to filter signal from environment. Hiroshima, in 1945, which required no further explanation. The specific 72 hours in October of 1983, when a Soviet early warning satellite had malfunctioned and reported an incoming strike, and one man had decided, against every protocol he had been trained to follow, not to launch a counterstrike, and the entire planet had balanced on the edge of the thing and then stepped back from it, and a conclave monitoring vessel hovering at the system's edge had recorded the event and immediately left, its crew reportedly in a state of shock. 11 delegations, 11. Over 400 years, 11 separate attempts to make contact with Earth, and every one of them had encountered us at a moment of fire or upheaval or catastrophe, and every one of them had concluded that we were too dangerous, too volatile, too unpredictably destructive to approach. I sat with this for a while. I let it settle in the way that large information needs to settle before you can respond to it clearly. Then I looked up at Vez, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the archive room during the entire time I had been reading, and I started to laugh. Not cruelly. I want to be careful about that. Not with any satisfaction or contempt. I laughed the way a person laughs when they have been shown something so perfectly absurdly on the nose that the only honest response is a kind of helpless recognition. You kept picking the worst windows, I said. Vess regarded me with the careful stillness of someone who had not expected laughter. I do not understand. Every time you came, I said, every single time, you arrived when we were at our absolute worst. The fires, the revolutions, the moments when we were doing the most terrible things to each other. You came during all of them. I shook my head. Did nobody think to come on a Tuesday afternoon when nothing was happening? Did nobody think to check what was going on before committing to an approach? Vess was quiet for a moment. Then they said something that stopped my laughter immediately. We were navigating toward your highest energy output, they said. Our instruments detect civilizations by their energy signatures. When a civilization's energy output is at its peak, the signal is clearest and easiest to locate. We followed the signal. We came when your signal was brightest. I looked at them. Your brightest signals, Vess continued, with a precision that made it worse, were always your fires. I sat with that for a long, long moment. It was true. Of course it was true. Of course the fires burned brighter than the libraries. Of course the weapons made more noise than the music. Of course the moments of our greatest destruction were the ones that broadcast themselves most loudly into space. And of course a civilization using energy signatures to navigate had followed the loudest broadcast, over and over, for 400 years, and found us at our worst, over and over, and concluded that our worst was what we were. Why did you keep the chair? I asked. My voice was very level. After 11 delegations came back with reports like these, why did you keep the chair at that table with that placard? Vess did not answer immediately. The silence in the archive room was very different from the silence in the session chamber. It was the silence of old things, and old choices, and something that had been carried for a very long time. Because of the Keth, Vess said at last. We kept the chair because of the Keth. They were the first delegation we sent, in 1610. They did not come back. For 400 years, we assumed they had been lost. I straightened very slowly in my chair. You said assumed, I said. Vess looked at me with those ancient, careful eyes. Yes. Which means they weren't. The last transmission from their vessel, Vess said, was received 14 days after they landed. It said they had made contact. It said they were meeting with the local population. It said they were astonished. A pause. It said they intended to remain for an extended observation period and would transmit further reports in due course. And then nothing, I said. And then nothing. For 416 years. I turned back to the display surface, and I thought about a Keth vessel landing in Western Europe in 1610, and two things happened in my mind at exactly the same time. The first thing was a question. The second thing was the beginning of an answer, so large and so strange and so completely unexpected that it took my breath away. "Vess," I said slowly, "what do the Keth look like?" "Biologically adaptable," Vess said. "One of the most adaptable species in the Conclave's history. Their physical form can, given sufficient exposure and time, approximate the dominant biological template of whatever environment they occupy." My pulse had become very loud in my own ears. "How long does that process take?" "1 generation, approximately, possibly 2, in cases of significant biological distance." "And they've been on Earth," I said, "since 1610. "Yes." "That's 16 generations," I said. "Give or take." Vess said nothing, but the expression on their face, translated across the gap of species and time, and 400 years of waiting, was the expression of someone who had been sitting with a thought for a very long time, and had been waiting for someone else to arrive at it. I looked at the display surface. I looked at the record of the Keth vessel landing in Western Europe in 1610 and going silent. I thought about adaptable. I thought about 16 generations. I thought about everything human history contained that could not be explained, and had never quite been explained. The inventions that arrived too early, the ideas that spread too fast, the individuals who seemed to know things they should not have been able to know. "I need to run a cross-reference," I said, "Keth biometric data against Earth's historical records. I need access to every genealogical database Earth has made available to the Conclave's network." "That access was granted the moment you sat in that chair," Vess said. I turned to the display surface and began. For the next 6 hours I did not move, did not speak, did not drink my coffee, and did not once look away from what the cross-reference was returning. The Keth had not been lost. The Keth had not been destroyed. The Keth had landed in Florence in the autumn of 1610, and they had done what their biology had shaped them to do across 4 million years of contact with other civilizations. They had adapted, they had integrated, and they had stayed. Their genetic markers were there. Not obvious, not dominant, but traceable. A thread running through certain family lines across the centuries, appearing and disappearing and reappearing, always associated with individuals who had displayed what the historical records tended to describe as unusual capacities for learning, unusual breadth of knowledge, unusual ability to move between disciplines as though the barriers between them were suggestions rather than walls. I found the linguistic markers next. Certain phrases, certain syntactic constructions, appearing in the writings of individuals across different countries and centuries, who could not have been in contact with each other, but who shared this specific thread, a way of describing complex ideas in terms of interconnected systems, a particular habit of thinking in networks rather than lines, that was not common to human cognition at the time, but that appeared, consistently, in the written work of individuals whose family lines carried the Keth genetic trace. And then I found the names. I had known, from the moment Vess described the Keth's capacity for biological adaptation, that the cross-reference was going to return a name I recognized. I had been bracing for it without knowing exactly which name it would be. When the result appeared on the display surface, I sat back in my chair and was silent for a long time, because the name was one of the most famous names in all of human history, and the childhood records behind it did not quite add up in the way that childhood records usually did. And the knowledge that this individual had possessed, the knowledge of anatomy, of engineering, of flight, of hydraulics, of optics, of a dozen other fields simultaneously, was knowledge that should not have existed in that time and place, and yet it had, and it had spread, and it had changed everything. I said the name aloud, just quietly, to myself, in the empty archive room. From the corridor outside came the sound of Thesivane arriving at the door, and when she stepped in and saw my face, she stopped walking, and she said, very quietly, "You found it." "Yes," I said. "We suspected," she said. "We have suspected for a very long time, but we could never confirm it without Earth's records, and Earth was never a member, and we could not access the records. And so we suspected, and we sat with the suspicion for a very long time." How many people in the conclave know? I asked. Vess, she said. Myself. 3 others on the archive staff. The archivist before Vess, who told Vess before she retired. It passes down in the archive, this suspicion, like a story told quietly, from keeper to keeper. I turned back to the display surface and looked at the cross-reference results. The Keth genetic thread, running through human history like a bright wire through dark water. 16 generations of people who were, in the most complex and beautiful and completely unprecedented sense of the word, both human and Keth, simultaneously, by inheritance and by choice, because the original landing party had not integrated out of desperation or confusion or loss of identity. They had integrated because they had chosen to, because the last transmission said they were astonished, because something in the mess and the noise and the impossible, improbable, magnificent chaos of human civilization had caught them and held them, and they had decided to stay. I thought about the chair in the session chamber. 400 years old, dusty, reserved. I thought about the founding charter, which Vess had mentioned, which had insisted the chair be kept. The founding charter, I said slowly. The Keth insisted on that clause, about the chair. The Keth were among the founders of the conclave, Thessivane said. Their formal representative was the last to sign the charter before departing for Earth. They insisted, as a condition of their signature, that a seat be reserved at the table for humanity. No matter how long it took, no matter what the contact report said, the seat was to remain. She paused. Their exact words, in the charter, were that humanity would come when humanity was ready, and that when they came they would fill the room. I looked at the display surface. I looked at the last recovered fragment of the Keth landing party's final transmission, decoded now after 4 centuries because I had asked for the full version, and Vess had given it to me. It was not in Keth script. It was in Italian. It had been written by hand on whatever surface was available when the transmission was made, scanned and sent because a Keth diplomat in 1610, 16 days after landing in Florence, had apparently decided that the language of where they had landed was the right language for what they wanted to say. The words were simple. The translation was exact. They are not dangerous, they are marvelous. And below the words, drawn with the particular confident precision of someone who had clearly been watching a specific human being work and had been captivated by what they saw, was a sketch, anatomically detailed, geometrically perfect, a human figure, arms extended, inscribed in a circle and a square. The Vitruvian Man, drawn by a Keth diplomat in the year 1610, sent into space as the last message of a species that had decided, upon meeting us, that they were not going back. I sat in the archive room for a very long time after that. Outside, the binary stars burned on in the dark. The full session of the conclave reconvened the following morning, and the atmosphere in the chamber was unlike anything I had experienced during the previous day's careful protocols. Something had shifted overnight. Word had moved through the station the way word moves through any enclosed community, which is to say quickly, and in every direction at once. And by the time I walked into the chamber and took my seat, the old wooden chair with the tarnished placard, the 214 representatives arranged around the table were in a state that I can only describe as controlled agitation. Not all of them. The Velhari delegation, which included Thessivan, maintained their characteristic stillness. The Kaveth archivist Vess sat at the far end of the table with an expression of patient authority. But the Drathek collective, 7 representatives of a species I had identified from the files as one of the conclave's oldest and most politically influential members, were in open communication with each other in a way that broke formal session protocol, their translators generating a low, constant hum of crosstalk that set my teeth slightly on edge. A representative I had not yet met rose from their seat before the session was formally opened. They were Harnek, a species from the outer arm, large and deliberate in their movements, with a quality of attention that reminded me of someone who had spent a very long time learning to be careful. Their name, as the translation matrix rendered it, was something close to the sound of wind in a particular kind of grass, and they had told me the previous evening during the brief social hour that I could call them Callus. Before this session is opened formally, Callus said, I wish to raise a point of protocol. The information recovered from the Conclave's sealed archive, cross-referenced with data provided by the provisional Earth member, represents a discovery of significant consequence. It is my position that this session should address that discovery before any other business. The presiding chair, a Velhari senior member named Oventhus, acknowledged this with a slow incline of their head. The point is noted and granted. Dr. Osei, the session recognizes you. I stood up. It was not a complicated decision. I had been preparing for it since the moment I left the archive room the previous night, not in the sense of writing a speech or rehearsing arguments, but in the simpler sense of deciding what kind of person I was going to be in this room. Thank you, I said. I want to address the motion that I understand is being prepared by the Drathek Collective. I understand it is a motion for Earth's quarantine. A ripple moved around the table. Callus sat down slowly. From across the table, the lead Drathek representative, a being whose name translated roughly as a sequence of 3 specific tones, which the Matrix rendered as Neth, inclined their upper body in what I had already learned was the Drathek gesture for acknowledgement. The motion has not yet been formally submitted, Neth said, but you are correct, that it is under consideration. I would like to speak to it before it is submitted, I said, because I think there has been a misunderstanding. Not a dishonest one, but a significant one. Neth waited. The room waited. The quarantine motion, I said, is based, as I understand it, on the finding that the Keth, a species with 4 million years of disciplined, careful, methodologically precise contact protocols, integrated into human civilization within a single generation of landing, and did not return. The argument being made, I think, is that this demonstrates something dangerous about humanity, that we are in some way capable of overriding another species' autonomy or judgment, that we are, in effect, contagious. That is an accurate summary, Neth said. I want to offer a different interpretation, I said. Not to dispute the facts. The facts are the facts. I have read every record in that archive. I know what happened during every one of those 11 contact attempts. I know what the delegations found and what they concluded, and why they turned back. I am not here to tell you that those conclusions were unreasonable given what they observed. They were completely reasonable given what they observed. I paused. The problem, I said, is that what they observed was not what we were. It was what we looked like at our very worst. Every delegation came during a fire, or a conflict, or a moment of catastrophe. Not because we are always in catastrophe. We are not. But because your instruments navigate toward high energy output, and our high energy output, for most of our history, has been generated by our worst events. That is not unique to us. I would be surprised if it is not true of most species in this room. The question is what happens in between. Nobody spoke. Between the fire of 1628 and the conflict of 1789, I said, we built the scientific method. We established the first public libraries. We mapped the stars without any instrument more sophisticated than a lens ground by hand. We wrote music that people still listen to 4 centuries later. Between 1789 and the first of the great modern conflicts, we abolished the formal practice of enslaving other human beings. Not completely, not everywhere, not without tremendous resistance and pain, but we abolished it, and we kept abolishing it, generation by generation, each time a little further. I looked around the table. Between the conflict of 1916 and the event of 1945, we discovered penicillin. We invented the concept of the welfare state. We produced the Declaration of Human Rights, and then spent the following 80 years arguing about what it meant, and whether we were living up to it, which is not a failure. It is the process by which a species gets better. I let that land. I am not here to argue that we are peaceful, I said. We are not always peaceful. I am not here to argue that we are wise. We are not always wise. I am here to argue that the pattern of our history is not the one those reports describe. The pattern of our history is a species that keeps doing terrible things, and then, slowly, messily, with enormous resistance and backsliding and argument, deciding not to do them anymore. That is not a species to be quarantined. That is a species in the process of becoming. The silence in the room was different from the silence of the previous morning. This one had texture to it. The Keth did not stay because we trapped them, I said. They stayed because they found something they had never found in 4 million years of contact with other civilizations. Something that grew faster than it destroyed. Not much faster. Sometimes barely, but faster. I looked at Neth. That is not a danger. That is the most hopeful thing I have heard since I arrived here. Neth was quiet for a long moment. Then they said, "And if we accept your interpretation, what do you propose?" "I propose," I said, "that instead of quarantining us, you come and see what we have been building in between the fires. I propose that you let the Keth descendants know that we know, and that they are welcome at this table, as both of the things they are. I propose that Earth takes its seat, and you discover, slowly, that the thing you were afraid of is not what we are." I sat down. The room stayed quiet for another moment. Then Callus spoke from across the table. "I would like to support Dr. Osei's statement with a secondary observation," they said. "The quarantine motion requires a supermajority. I will be voting against it. I invite others who share my position to indicate." The vote was taken 20 minutes later, after a period of formal deliberation that I spent sitting very still in the old wooden chair and drinking the last of my terrible coffee from the thermos I had brought into the session chamber because nobody had told me I could not, and I had decided that this counted as permission. 198 votes against the quarantine motion, 16 in favor. The motion failed. In the gallery above the chamber, where observers and junior staff were permitted to watch sessions, I could see Thesivane standing at the rail. She was very still, the way Velhari are still when they are feeling something they are not accustomed to feeling. Her eyes, when I found them in the crowd, were very bright. I thought about the Keth landing party, stepping out of their vessel in Florence in 1610, and finding something so extraordinary that they had spent the next 16 generations living inside it. I thought about 11 delegations turning around in fear because they had found us at our worst. I thought about a chair sitting empty at the head of a table for 400 years because someone who had seen us up close had insisted it be kept. The session resumed its regular business. I opened my laptop, somewhere above us. Through the transparent ceiling, the binary stars burned on, and I found them by looking up for a moment, before returning to the screen. Then I opened a new document, titled it simply, First Session Notes, and began to type. What came next was bureaucracy. I mean that with deep affection, because there is a certain kind of comfort in paperwork when everything around you is the largest thing that has ever happened to a member of your species. Bureaucracy means process. Process means continuation. And continuation, after the kind of morning I had just had, felt like a profound mercy. Formally registering Earth as a full member of the Galactic Conclave involved 14 separate forms in the Conclave's standard administrative protocol, 3 biological samples for the genetic registry, 1 formal philosophical declaration stating that Earth did not intend to expand its territorial claims through force during the provisional membership period, and a verification witness process that required a member of at least 4 other species to countersign in sequence. The whole process was supposed to take between 10 days and several years, depending on how organized the incoming member was. I finished it in an afternoon. The junior conclave administrator who had been assigned to manage my registration process, a young Velhari named Pevith, who could not have been more than the Velhari equivalent of 25, and who regarded me throughout the process with an expression of barely contained fascination, informed me at the end of the 3rd form that most species took between several months and a decade just to complete the philosophical declaration. "Why?" I asked. "Because the philosophical declaration requires the representative to speak on behalf of their entire civilization's intentional values," Pevith said. "Most civilizations spend considerable time debating what those values are, before they can commit them to the form." "I wrote mine this morning," I said, "on the transport from my quarters." Pevith looked at the form, then at me. "Yes," they said, "I can see that." "Is it a problem?" "No," they said, "it is just very fast." "We have a word for that kind of energy," I said. "Where I come from, we call it Tuesday." Pevith did not entirely understand the reference, but they filed the form without further comment, and by early evening, my registration packet was complete and submitted to the formal ratification queue, where it would be reviewed and confirmed at the next full session within the week. That evening, Thesivane came to my quarters with a bottle of something that was not quite wine but occupied the same emotional space as wine, and she sat across the small table from me and poured 2 glasses, and we drank them without speaking for a little while, which was its own kind of conversation. "The vote today," she said eventually. "Yes," I said. 198 to 16, she said. "That margin surprised many people. Did it surprise you?" She considered this. "No. I had hoped for it. I had not been certain of it." She turned her glass in her hands. "What you said, about the things that happened between the fires, it reached something. I watched the chamber change while you were speaking. I have sat in this chamber for 30 years of Velhari time. I have seen many things. I have not seen that before." "What did it look like?" I asked. She thought about it carefully, the way Velhari think about things, not rushing to the answer, but turning it over until she was sure she had it right. "It looked like recognition," she said finally, "like a room full of species who have all survived something, recognizing the description of survival." I sat with that for a moment. "Thesivane," I said, "did the Velhari have something like us?" "In their history." She was quiet for a moment. "Every species in that chamber had something like you in their history," she said. "The difference is that most of them did not have it so recently, or so loudly, or so publicly. Most of them have had time to let the worst parts become history. You are still very close to yours." She paused. "But close is not the same as stuck." I thought about that later, after she had gone, lying on the small bed in my quarters looking at the ceiling. Close is not the same as stuck. I thought about all the things that were close, the events that were still within living memory, or within 2 or 3 generations of living memory, the things that had not yet had time to become simply history rather than wound. And I thought about all the things that were further, the changes that had settled into the structure of the world so completely that people forgot they had ever been otherwise. The first Keth contact had been made the following morning, quietly, through channels that Vess had established with the cooperation of 2 of the Conclave's most experienced xenogenetic specialists. It was not a public event. It was a private communication, transmitted through a secure node in the Conclave's network to a specific address on Earth, that the cross-reference had identified as the most likely point of contact for a Keth descendant who was aware of their heritage. The response came back in 4 hours. In English, the message was short. "We know. We have always known. We are grateful that you found us. We would like to speak with you when it is appropriate. Please tell the archivist that the sketch was drawn by our grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, and that we still have the original." I read the message 3 times. Then I went and told Vess, who did something with their expression that I had never seen Kavith do before, and which Thesivane later told me was the equivalent of weeping with relief. Over the following days, further contacts were made, through the same quiet channels, with Keth descendants across the world. Some were fully aware, some were partially aware. They knew something was different about their family history, but had not been certain what. Some were not aware at all, and received the news with a variety of responses that ranged from shock to immediate, absolute recognition of something they had always felt without being able to name. The unanimous response, from every single one of them, was the same as the first. "We are home." That was the word they used. Not Earth, not their ancestral species' territory. Home. Every one of them, asked where they belonged, said the same thing. They belonged here. They had always belonged here. The biology was complicated, and the history was extraordinary, and the question of what they were was genuinely interesting, but the answer to where they were from was simple, and it did not waver. They were from Earth. They were human. They were also Keth. These things were not in conflict. They were just all true at once, and the world, in their experience, was large enough to hold all 3. 3 days after the vote, the Drathek Collective submitted a formal request for a cultural exchange delegation to Earth. This surprised me considerably, given that Neth had led the initial push for quarantine. I mentioned my surprise to Thesivane, who said, with the Velhari version of dry amusement, that the Drathek were extremely consistent in their approach to things they found alarming, which was to study them closely until they were no longer alarming, and that a request for a cultural exchange was, for the Drathek, functionally indistinguishable from an apology. They also, through a separate and slightly more formal channel, requested information on human food preparation methods. Specifically, they had somehow obtained a description of a lamb stew and wanted to know if the technique could be adapted for a species that experienced flavor primarily through a gland located in what would roughly correspond to a human elbow. I told them I would ask someone more qualified than me to follow up on that. On the fourth day, Thesivane walked me to the outer observation gallery after the morning session had closed, and we stood at the transparency panel together, looking out at the binary stars. The station was quiet at this hour. Most of the session business happened in the mornings and the evenings, and the midday period had a particular quality of pause that I had come to look forward to. "I want to ask you something," Thesivane said. "All right," I said. "Are you afraid?" I looked at the stars. "Of what specifically?" "Of what comes next," she said. "Earth is now known. Not suspected, not theorized, known. By 214 civilizations, as a full member of the conclave. The Keth are among you, and will be acknowledged as such. Your world is no longer the only inhabited world you know of. Everything changes now." She paused. "I have watched many species go through this moment, the moment of full entry. Some of them handle it well, some of them do not. I want to know which you expect to be." I thought about this honestly, because Thesivane had earned honest answers, and because the question deserved one. "A little afraid, yes," I said. "I think fear is the right response to large changes. It means you're taking them seriously." I looked out at the stars. "But we've been afraid before, of each other mostly, of the dark, of the things we couldn't explain. We've been afraid of almost everything at one point or another, and it never really stopped us from walking toward it anyway." I turned slightly to look at her. "That's not bravery exactly. I don't think it's bravery when you can't quite make yourself stop. I think it's just what we do." Thesivane was quiet for a moment. "The Keth's last transmission said they were astonished," she said, "after 16 days on your planet, before they had even begun to integrate." "Yes," I said. "What do you think astonished them?" I had been thinking about that question since the moment I first read the transmission. I had turned it over in the archive room, and on the transport back to my quarters, and in the long hours of the night when I had not been sleeping. And I had arrived, after all that turning, at an answer I was fairly confident was right. "Everything that happens in between," I said, the same thing I told the chamber. "The fires are loud, the disasters are loud, the worst moments are always the loudest. But the things that happen in between, the kindness that nobody records, the small decisions that don't make the history books, the person who stops to help, and the person who changes their mind, and the person who tries again after failing. Those are quiet. They're very quiet. But they are constant. They never stop. And I think the Keth stepped out of their vessel in 1610 and found a world that was, yes, full of fire and confusion, and all the worst things that the delegations after them would document and flee from. And also, at the same time, in every street and every home and every conversation, so continuously and persistently full of people trying to be decent to each other that they could not bring themselves to leave." Thesivane looked at the stars. "That is," she said slowly, "a very significant thing to discover after 4 million years of looking." "I imagine it might be," I said. She said nothing else for a while. We stood together in the observation gallery and watched the binary stars, and the station turned slowly around us, and somewhere on the other side of that vast dark between the stars, Earth went on being Earth, complicated and loud and messy and occasionally terrible and, in between all of those things, relentlessly, stubbornly, quietly full of people trying. I called home that evening. It was the first proper call I had been able to make since the signal delay had stabilized through the relay network the conclave had set up, and my mother answered on the third ring with the expression of someone who had been waiting by the phone for 2 weeks and was not going to admit it. "Well," she said. "We have a seat at the table," I told her. "Is the food any good?" she said. I laughed for a long time at that. Long enough that she started laughing too, without knowing why, just because I was laughing, which was the thing she had always done when I was a child, and which I had not realized until that moment I had missed so much. "The food is terrible," I told her. "You would not believe the food." Bring some back anyway, she said. Your aunt will want to try it. We talked for an hour. About the station, about the binary stars, about the chamber and the vote, and the old wooden chair with the tarnished placard. About Thesivane, whom my mother immediately decided she liked based on the description alone. About the Keth, which took some explaining, and which my mother received with the particular quality of calm that she had always brought to extraordinary information, the calm of someone who had survived enough surprises to know that the world was larger than any one map of it. At the end of the call, before the connection dropped, she said, "Are you coming home?" "Eventually," I said. "There's a lot of work here first." "There always is," she said. "But come home when you can. Bring Thesivane. I'll cook." The call ended. I sat in the quiet of my quarters for a moment, looking at the stars through the panel above my bed. Then I opened my laptop. The conclave's formal business queue had 17 items pending review from the New Earth delegation. The cultural exchange request from the Drathek needed a response. The formal acknowledgement letter to the Keth community representatives needed a second draft. The preliminary report for the United Nations on membership protocols and initial session proceedings needed to be started, reviewed, and sent through the relay network before the end of the week. I had, by my estimate, approximately 4 hours of work before I needed to sleep. I picked up the thermos, found that it was empty, and made another cup of instant coffee. It was, as always, not very good. I drank it anyway. Then I pulled the laptop closer, positioned it on my knees, and began. Outside, the binary stars burned on in the dark. The conclave station turned its slow circle in the space between them. Somewhere in the great curved chamber 3 levels above me, a dusty wooden chair sat at the head of the oldest table in the known galaxy, with a tarnished placard that read, "Earth, Sol System, Humanity," and for the first time in 400 years it was not empty. I had work to do. I had always had work to do. That had not changed, and I was not certain it ever would. That, it occurred to me, was probably exactly the point.